So I'm going to say a few things about Hayek, maybe a little overview of his ideas as I'm here at his grave. And so I already mentioned that Hayek is kind of like an evolutionary thinker based on the quote I previously read. So if one looks at the social order is very complex, and all that complexity requires knowledge, right? If one looks at the evolution of life itself, about 4 billion years ago, we just had this sort of chemical soup that we learn about in our biology class. And eventually, natural selection evolved this beautiful mechanism, which we refer to as biological evolution. It deals with genes, mutations, selection. And ultimately, what that does is just spreads knowledge of how to create life. And that knowledge is stored in our genes. So that mechanism worked really well for a long time. But eventually, animals and creatures that had brains evolved. So no longer was the knowledge of how to create biological order of life constrained to just genes. Now, once you have a brain, you can understand the world around you, and your actions can be a lot more flexible, leading to higher fitness and productivity. So once we got creatures with brains, about 500 million years ago, eventually, if we fast forward, we had creatures like human beings that not only had brains that could act, but they could also interact with fellow animals and creatures and reach even higher levels of productivity. And that really leads us to anatomically modern man. But now, we're kind of stuck in this little tribal world of, maybe 25 to 100 people. And that social order was very simple because the knowledge that coordinated the social order was very simple itself. It is knowledge that could only fit in the brains of 25 to 100 people. That knowledge was more or less repeated across every brain. The man knew how to hunt and create some simple tools, break a few stones to create some sharp rocks, remove the leaves from a tree branch to create a spear, that sort of thing. And since the knowledge was repeated across every brain, again, little knowledge leads to a very simple social order. And if one looks at like biology, for example, like E. coli bacteria might have about 4,000 genes. With that amount of information, they can only just eat some simple stuff, grow, divide, eat simple stuff, grow, divide. But once you have a human cell that has 20,000 genes, you can now take part in this massive division of labor. You can become a heart cell, a kidney cell, a brain cell, and help create something that is much bigger and more productive. Well, the same thing happened to human beings. At about 20,000, 30,000 years ago, natural selection began to evolve another wonderful mechanism. It evolved what economists like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and guys from the Austrian school refer to as the market process. And the market process is a mechanism that stores knowledge and spreads productive order throughout society. And it took human beings from little tribes of about 150 people to the nearly 8 billion human being massive social organism, to borrow a phrase from Herbert Spencer, that we have today. So, the market process, I'll say just one quick thing about how the market process works, okay? Just one component of the market process is economic competition. Competition is what motivates and spreads superior knowledge through the social order. If you look at society from high above, kind of like Google Maps, you can envision all the people. Sometimes you can watch like music videos where they show like society moving in fast motion, right? You see the cars moving very quickly. You see the people acting. So that order is coordinated, right? It's in a constant cycle of production, because people work and they produce wealth. They produce cars, food, energy, etc. And they're also consuming wealth. They use all that up. And it is thanks to the fact that the social order produces more than it consumes that society can keep growing and so on. And that delicate balance of production and consumption requires precise knowledge. So that is what the market process does. It creates knowledge, spreads knowledge, and the actions and the subsequent social order that arises from that knowledge. So I'll just briefly say something about competition. Now, there's many parts to the market process. I could talk about how the price system works, what interest rates do, but I'll just focus on competition. So competition is what really spreads superior knowledge and subsequent order throughout the social order. For example, why is it that pretty much all all cars these days have power door locks and windows? Because it was a good idea. Somebody came up with the idea and then they put it in cars, and then that motivated all the other auto manufacturers to copy that knowledge and add it to their own automobiles. Now, they wanted to do this because they wanted to make as much money as the auto manufacturer that first came up with the idea, and inevitably they were forced to do it, right? If an auto manufacturer does not copy the superior knowledge, right, the power door locks, the power windows, the anti-lock brakes, and so on, eventually they go out of business. So competition is something that motivates everyone to come up with superior ideas. It motivates everyone to copy the superior ideas of others, and inevitably it forces the entire social order to use the latest and greatest knowledge. And this is something that happens. We don't need a central planner to do this. All you really need is just freedom. Okay? You need freedom of the entrepreneur. Whenever somebody has a good idea, they need to have the freedom to act, to create, to bring that about. Every time somebody starts a business is because somehow they're trying to make the world a better place, because they believe that other people, with their freedom, they will choose their new business from all the other alternatives. So they will be making their lives better off. Otherwise, they would keep doing what they were doing before, whatever product they were buying before. So you need the freedom of the entrepreneur to implement this good idea, and then through competition, if the idea is really better than the alternatives, it'll spread to all the other competitors. And also, very important, you need the freedom of the consumer, right? It is the consumer that is constantly looking at the social order for things that make his life better. And every time he gives his money to company A instead of company B, as Ludwig von Mises famously pointed out in one of his essays, he's sort of like voting. He's voting with his dollars, with his money. He's giving money and life to a superior company or social order, and by withdrawing his money from all the other alternatives, he's forcing all the other alternatives to copy the superior knowledge, whether it is getting a better supplier, hiring people that are more hardworking, etc. So competition is really what spreads knowledge through society. And in order for competition to work, you need individual freedom. So this is just, it's not enough. I wish it could be, but this is one of the main reasons why communism and socialism and ideologies where you have the government try to run everything, you have a big monopoly, right? The government is a monopoly. It is immune from competition. If you were in the Soviet Union and you're creating these cars or whatever, there's only one bureaucracy that's creating the cars. In the free market, in a free society, you have many competitors, all trying their best, to come up with the best ideas. And so again, in a big monopolistic institution, you do not have that. In the private sector, every company has every incentive to make as much money because they can keep all their profits. But if you're part of a big bureaucracy, you don't have that incentive. You're always going to make whatever the government bureaucrat tells you that your salary ought to be. And this is just one of the many reasons why, freedom and the free market has great advantages over communism, which is unworkable. But anyways, I can't go too much into that. But so that is just one component of the market process, okay? Competition. Now, something very important with respect to how Hayek saw the world, something like competition, it's not something that mankind, no group of smart economists or people back in the day thought to themselves, if we have competition, we're going to have these great benefits. We're going to be creating knowledge and spreading knowledge to society, and it's going to be wonderful. No, it is not. Competition and the entire market process and interest rate coordination and prices, things that I will not get into here, they are things that just sort of evolved through an evolutionary process. They share this trait with language. Language too is a result of human action, but it's not something that human beings planned or invented. No group of cavemen thousands of years ago, sat down and just thought to themselves, let's invent language so we can better communicate and we'll have a bunch of great benefits, right? So even though language is the result of human action, it is not the result of conscious human planning or design. And the same thing applies to law and also governments, religions. Those are all things that are evolutionary growths and not the result of human planning. So this is the kind of thing that, really, I don't want to say that sets Hayek apart from all the other economists, but this is something that he really focused on. He really focused on the evolutionary aspect of how the social order evolved. And he greatly criticized people who believed that man's reason was like the main driver of all of these things. He believed that far more important than man's reason, it was a process of competition between different societies that is what really designed culture. For example, picture two tribal societies. In one tribal society, for whatever reason, the shaman one day had a dream while he was high on some mushrooms, and he thought that, oh, no, our God says that men and women, should be equal in the hunt, and so on. But let's just assume that for whatever reason, women just aren't as good hunters. Maybe they can't run as fast to grab the animal or whatever. So because of this, this particular society, based on their custom, they might not be as good hunters. They might have more untimely deaths. Some of these women might die. They might not give birth. And for that reason, inadvertently, they did not have as many offspring. And maybe someday there came a time to have a war between this particular tribe and a tribe that did not have that custom. A tribe that wisely said, okay, we'll have the man hunt the bigger beasts, and we'll have the woman just go around hunting and gathering. And maybe because of that, they were able to have a bigger population. And when it came time to do the fighting, this second society won over the first one, and therefore their rules, are the ones that spread. So it wasn't anybody's designing. It was just competition between groups that ended up really doing the designing of culture. So that is something, that Hayek was really big on, And so culture and the market process and these things are something that have evolved on their own. And so again, Hayek, he even said it, even as incredible, as Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and all these other economists of the Austrian school were, he himself felt like this important evolutionary aspect was really missing. And he thought that basically Karl Menger, after Karl Menger, Hayek said that there really wasn't somebody who was looking at the world as this evolutionary aspect, until I came along, he said. And I think there is some truth to that. Again, this is not some stab at some of these other great economists. I oftentimes wish that Hayek had been more Rothbardian in a sense, where he really, Hayek, there's some point even in this book here in volume 3 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where Hayek said that all progress inevitably has to be based on tradition and in this evolutionary process. And, to a large degree that is true, but there comes a point where human beings can understand how the market process works, how increased freedom is what we really need. And now we can see that we can start privatizing things. So now our reason, can play a bigger role. And we're in the midst of this gigantic intellectual revolution. We have all these young people learning about the Austrian school, very cocky and brash, and it's quickly becoming the popular culture. These days, if you're young and you're not, hating the government, you're just not that cool. And hopefully soon this will continue, to spread. And but as wonderful as the libertarian revolution is, it is still not Hayekian. And I think that as this intellectual revolution spreads, as more people wake up to freedom and the Austrian school, more people will be looking at von Mises and Rothbard and so on. And the more they look at all these great men, the more they will look at Hayek. And the more they look at Hayek, inevitably they will stumble upon the evolutionary understanding of how the world works. So I think, all roads, if Hayek is correct, and it is true that the only way to really understand the world is through this process of selective evolution, then if he is correct, then it just makes sense that society eventually gets closer and closer to that truth. And I think one of the most exciting things as far as like the intellectual world is like Matt Ridley's recent book, How Everything Evolves. It's a very good book from a very famous biologist that does a great job of quoting Hayek and trying to show how the entire world is an evolutionary growth. Now, this is something one still doesn't see that much from mainstream libertarianism, and I think there's very good reasons for that. Tradition has been the guardian of really hardcore freedom. There's a strong moralist aspect to the libertarian world. A lot of people, look at something like the non-aggression principle, and a lot of people come to libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism from a more religious and traditional-based approach. And I think that is still like the main driver, the main ideological driver of the anarcho-capitalist, pro-freedom revolution that we're seeing. But so I still think that at some point more emphasis, at least more people will stumble upon Hayek's evolutionary worldview. And let me see what else. Maybe I'll finish here by some quotes from Hayek.